So, this lecture is going to cover the agricultural and industrial changes Mao made in China between the years 1949 and 1976. It's going to cover the 5-year plans, the plans which changed agriculture and industry, and were sort of a branch off of the 5-year plans that took place in the USSR. So, when Mao and the CCP take over China in 1949, the economy is essentially in ruins. Industry had been completely destroyed and was at 25% of pre-war levels. We can see from this graph here that the monetary inflation of China starts to go up from 1941 and substantially increases by the point of 1949. So much so that the inflation rate in 1949 is at 1,000%. So when Mao takes over, he decides there are certain things that he needs to do straight away. And one of those things is to fix hyperinflation. And he does this by fixing wages at low rates. And what that does is, effectively, it takes down the inflation rate from 1,000% to 15% within the space of a year. So we can see that here. On top of that, he also increases taxes on businesses. And in 1953, the government takes over all businesses and plans and organises everything that's produced by these businesses. So they decide what is produced and they decide what is going to be given out to the people. On top of that, in 1951, they also decide to nationalise the banks. So all private banks are abolished and they introduce this thing called the People's Bank in 1951. And what this does is it stabilises the currency in China. They also replace railway links. The railways become nationalised, and what the aim of these railway links is to provide the industries with coal. Okay, so that is the predominant aim of the railway links. So the economy starts to show signs of stability by 1953. And Mao takes this as an opportunity to launch his first 5-year plan. And the aim of that first 5-year plan is to nationalise the entire industry and collectivise agriculture. He did this with the help of the USSR, and he established an ambitious plan to build new industries. And in order to do this, he used the help of thousands of Russian scientists and engineers who supervised the projects in China. Now, the big focus of the first 5-year plan was to increase heavy industries. So it focused on the production of steel, coal, and chemicals. And he wanted this in order to build planes, trains, and engines to improve the transport system in China. Now, we can see here from this map, from this image, it's showing us railway links. Now, the 5-year plan was quite successful in creating crisscross railways in China. So vital goods could now be moved across the country. What this also meant is we saw an influx of the population from the countryside moving into the towns and the cities, as new jobs were created for peasants in these new industries. And overall, the first 5-year plan could be deemed a success, as it increased industrial production between the years 53 to 57 by 50%, so it went up. So Mao considered this a success. So much so that in 1958 he launches the second 5-year plan, and this is known as the Great Leap Forward. He wanted to build on the success of the first and believed that it would be possible for China to take over Britain as the leading industrial power. But he did believe it was important to achieve mass mobilisation to succeed here. So he launched the second campaign. He felt that the first one had been moving far too slowly and it resulted in too much bureaucracy. So he wanted to decentralise the local cadres and mobilise the masses in order to achieve this. The main focus of the second 5-year plan was to increase the production of iron and steel. But there were also 3 main aims, in that the political aims for this were to achieve another revolution, to take away the control from the middle classes and put it in the hands of the working class. So that's our political aim. Our social aim was to mobilise the masses to continue revolution and boost growth. He also wanted to abolish private family life and establish communal living as another ode to utopian communism. In terms of the economy, he wanted to turn China into a powerful industrial nation as quickly as possible. So, what he does, in 1950, we see the launch of the Agrarian Reform Law. And what that does is it takes land from the landowners and gives it to the peasants. Okay, this is launched in 1950. To take that a step further, mutual aid teams are established in 1951. And what that was supposed to be is groups of 10 families coming together to work on the land, to join their resources, to join their manpower, and supposedly increase agricultural output. Mao takes this a step further in 1952 and introduces agricultural producers cooperatives. And that is the joining of mutual aid teams to form cooperatives, and that's made up of 40 to 50 families. Now the aims here again were to increase agricultural production by sharing resources, sharing skills, and increasing the manpower. And communal living becomes a focus for the CCP. Now, communes abolished private family sphere of peasant life. The collective and cooperative farms were joined into 24,000 communes with a population of 30,000 people in each commune. The communes were then organised into brigades of workers with approximately 1,000 to 2,000 and teams of 50 to 200. People were encouraged to join communes through the use of propaganda, but by 1958 the whole of China was organised into communes of about 700 million people. There were, in fact, some benefits to communal life. It meant that they were large enough to tackle large projects like irrigation, running their own schools and their own clinics. They were able to set up their own local industries for mining. People ate in mess halls. They had nurseries which looked after the children, which meant women could then work on the farmland. And they were also encouraged to carry out the same work as men. So women are starting to be seen as more of an equal sphere to men. In July 1955, that collectivization became forced. So people had to work on the land and they needed to work in communes. And this was made possible by the positive relation between the USSR and China, because it meant China were able to establish this policy of Lysenkoism. Now, Lysenko was a Russian scientist. He came up with a program for farmers to follow, which had some benefits, but some of his ideas were potentially dangerous. He encouraged the large use of fertilizers and pesticides, which eventually damaged the ecosystem of China and led to a declined agricultural output. So what we see is a decline in agricultural output, but in order to make the second five-year plan, the Great Leap Forward, seem successful, what Mao does is he launches figures, he publishes figures which are inflated. They are not reflective of the actual situation in China. That is both for the steel and the iron that is being produced. What Mao did is he claimed in 1957 that China would produce 40 million tons of steel. But by 1970, a year later, he claimed that it would actually be 700 million tons of steel. But the real numbers, as we've said already, were unknown because they were inflated by the party in order to keep the people on board. He continued to raise production targets and claimed anyone who did not support this was a counter-revolutionary. But the factories were in fact wasteful and inefficient. The steel that was being produced in backyard furnaces was essentially rubbish. They used too much of the coal supply and eventually their trains stopped operating. In order to meet these large production targets, people often fell asleep at machines out of fatigue from trying to meet them, and the machines broke and people often died at these machines. Now in 1959, Peng Dehuai, who was the head of the PLA at the time, spoke out at the Lushan conference. He issued his reservations about the plan and its successes, and that led to his downfall. A year later, in 1960, China was having to import grain and impose rationing on the people. They also had bad droughts, harvests were poor as well, and it led to approximately the death of 20 million Chinese people who starved to death because the agricultural output was so low. On top of that, Sino-Soviet relations became increasingly poor, and we saw the end of the Sino-Soviet Treaty in 1961 because the USSR wanted to separate themselves from these failures in China, and they wanted no part of it. So we then see, as we've said already, the death of 20 million people. Part of that reason is because communes were too large to be run effectively. People started to resent the CCP. They missed private family life. All of their wages were the same, so people had no incentive to work harder. Production rates fell. There was serious flooding and droughts, which led to mass destruction of agriculture, so food production fell drastically. It induced the start of the Great Famine, alongside the downfall of agricultural growth, and it led to widespread cannibalism. Now, at this time, Liu Shaoqi and Deng Xiaoping brought forward this idea of pragmatism, using realistic techniques to reinvent China's economy. But Mao labelled them as counter-revolutionaries. But the plan was failing to such an extent that Mao had no choice but to take partial blame for the Great Leap Forward. And in late 1958, he decides to resign as head of state. So following his resignation, Liu Shaoqi takes his place as president. Zhou Enlai remains Prime Minister of China, but Deng Xiaoping takes the role of the CCP's General Secretary. All three of these people wanted to abandon the Great Leap Forward. They chose to close down the backyard furnaces and return to private farming. And they did this through a third 5-year plan. And following that third 5-year plan, we saw a growth in China's economy and its industry, and a growth of pragmatism as an ideology in China. They moved from striving to achieve utopian communism to moving towards realism. So ultimately, the 5-year plans led to Mao falling from his position as head of state, economic devastation in China, and the loss of 20 million people.